On April 6, 1903, the city of Kishinev, the capital of the Russian province of Bessarabia, erupted in violence. A horrific pogrom was organized, targeting the Jewish population of Kishinev. After 3 days of violence, 49 Jews were dead, 500 were wounded, 1,300 homes and businesses were destroyed, and 2,000 families were left homeless. 81 years later, Delhi, the capital of the largest democracy in the world, India, was witness to a horror of even greater proportions. On October 31, 1984, Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India, was shot dead by her Sikh bodyguards. In retaliation, an orgy of murder, rape and arson was unleashed upon the Sikh residents of Delhi, in which more than 3,000 lost their lives. There are uncanny similarities between the Kishinev and Delhi pogroms. Both targeted minority communities, with violence following libel, innuendo, and propaganda designed to stoke fear and hatred. Kultar's mime synthesizes the sufferings of innocent victims of organized violence, separated by thousands of miles, numerous years, and insurmountable differences of religion, language, and culture. Blending poetry, painting, theater, and music, a collective of young adults tells a story of human suffering and courage, reminding us that in the end, all innocent victims are the same, regardless of which god they worship and what tongues they speak.
Welcome to Foundations TV, everybody. Our guests in the studio today are the creative team of Kultar's Mime, who have just returned from a world tour. They've been performing their wonderful play, a theatrical production, all around, and have received wonderful feedback. So welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
So why don't we hear something about the whole entire concept from you?
So the play is about the 1984 anti-Sikh pogrom and is seen through the eyes of a Jewish artist collective. It's made up of 4 artists and a guide that take the audience through the series of paintings that helps the story that they're trying to understand come alive. It is a highly physical production. It's rooted in movement styles, and the text is all poetry.
Kultar's Mime, the play, is based on a poem of the same name, which was written, I would say, roughly about 25 years ago. And the poem is the story of several children who, after the 1984 pogrom, live in a neighborhood of Delhi called Tilak Vihar, which is also known as the Widow Colony. That's where a lot of the survivors of the massacre were settled in Delhi. I stumbled upon a paper written by Delhi anthropologist Dr. Veena Das, who is now at Johns Hopkins. She had been studying the children who had survived Tilak Vihar, and she published their stories in a paper that she wrote. And a couple of stories really struck me. One of them was a story about this young deaf-mute boy called Avatar, who sees his father being lynched from a tree before his eyes. And, being deaf and mute, he can't really articulate his pain. Every time when those memories come back, he goes into a trance and he acts out what had happened to his father. So the story of Avatar got fictionalized into Kultar's story and became the basis for the poem Kultar's Mime. And the ferment that reading mostly these 3 things, the ferment that was created in my mind was really the impetus for Kultar's Mime, the poem. So that was written about 25 years ago, and I really never did much with it until Meher Kaur decided to turn it into a play, so I'll turn it over to her.
Sure. So a couple of years ago, when I was in my first year of college, I go to Smith College in Northampton, I was really finding myself becoming interested in directing theater. And I was looking for a project to do over the summer, and I had just become interested in physical theater and devised theater, and I was trying to look for a story that would suit what I wanted to work on and what I wanted to make. And I was just thinking about work and something to adapt, and I remembered this poem and how a long time ago we had tried to theatricalize it and physicalize it and mime out the characters. And I thought that concept was really interesting. So I read the play again, or the poem again, and realized that it was a story of pictures and that there was so much imagery and photography almost in the poem itself. And I wanted to sort of pick out those images and show them to an audience. And I realized that that could be really effective not only through theater but also through art and through visual art. So I commissioned one of my friends at Smith to create a series of paintings based on the poem. So we took those paintings out of the text, and then I sort of adapted it into a play. I created characters and used the text as dialogue and added a couple more texts to the beginning and the end to make it a full story.
Now, from what I understand, there's also connections with the Russian history. So would you like to talk about that? How did that come into this?
You know, there are patterns that run through human behavior, and you know, just like compassion is very universal, sometimes you find instances of hatred and horrible things happening across the world as well. So somewhat serendipitously, I stumbled upon this very powerful poem written by a Jewish, a Hebrew poet called Chaim Bialik, who was a young student studying in Odessa in 1903 when a massacre of Jews happened in the town of Kishinev, which was then in the Russian province of Bessarabia and is now in the nation of Moldova. So Bialik went to Kishinev, looked at what had happened, and in reaction and in response to the massacre, he wrote this very powerful poem called In the City of Slaughter. When I read In the City of Slaughter, I remember having goosebumps because, as you can imagine, since both poems talk about very similar instances where libel and propaganda are used to target a minority community simply based on who they are, so there was a lot of similarity in the imagery that was used in the poem. And the other aspect was that Bialik almost acts like a tour guide, you know, drawing the reader into the scenario, and the point that Meher made about the poem being visual, his poem is also very visual. So that's when Meher and I sat and talked about this, and the device that she had used in her play already had this collective of Western artists. So at that point, the Western artists became Jewish artists, who start out by wanting to commemorate and memorialize the victims of Kishinev, and then get to a point where they feel that it would be really powerful if they embraced the pain of the other, so to speak. And that's how they make the transition from talking about Kishinev to talking about Delhi. And I'll say this, that you know, it was a bit of an experiment, and audiences everywhere who've attended the play really latch on to this as one of the most powerful attributes, the fact that suffering is universal and compassion is also universal.
So speaking of audiences, you have traveled the world at this point. You have gone to how many countries now you've performed in?
We've performed in the US, of course, in Canada, in the UK, and India, so 4 countries so far.
4 countries so
yes.
far. And this is something recent that you just did it this year, right, the whole tour?
Yeah, so the play premiered in 2013,
okay.
And there was one performance in Hopkinton that was actually mounted by a theater company that Meher started called Two Path Productions.
Yeah, and we're sort of still in the middle of our tour, I guess. We started touring in September, October.
September of 2014.
And the company went to various places, and now we're getting ready to go to Washington, D.C. This weekend, Vancouver, Philadelphia, and India as well in March.
That's amazing. So how has the response been in the various countries?
It's really been overwhelming, very emotional, and startlingly uniform. And we have performed before a wide variety of audiences, and you know, I'll just give some examples. We've been to several universities. The second run, or the second incarnation of Kultar's Mime that premiered in September of 2014, premiered at Harvard. And we've been to Carleton, we've been to Stanford, we've been to Berkeley. So we've been to a bunch of universities, which where we have drawn a lot of audience members from student bodies, from academics, a lot of thinkers. We performed in British Parliament for an audience of MPs and members of the House of Lords. We performed before almost 1,500 people in Wolverhampton in an event commemorating 1984. In Delhi, in India, we had very interesting audiences in Delhi, in Chandigarh, and in Amritsar, which mostly drew, I would say, from the, quote, elites, because it's an English language play, and a lot of people who showed up were intellectuals, human rights activists, several members of parliament. And then at the other end of the spectrum, one of our most interesting performances was in a tiny village called Preetnagar, which is about 20 kilometers from Amritsar. And there our performance was before a 100% rural, almost completely non-English speaking audience. Indeed,
wow.
Indeed. So the amazing thing is that the play obviously is very emotional because of the subject matter and the portrayal. And I didn't perceive any difference between the reactions of audiences, Stanford or British Parliament or Preetnagar, the reaction was...
There's a human element.
Exactly,
It touches
exactly.
the hearts, regardless of
Indeed, we had tears at almost every show. Sometimes we had people who couldn't sit and who had to step out. I remember at the Dodge Film School at Chapman University, several professors walked up to me after the show. I mean, these are people with no connection to India or Sikhs, and they indicated how touched they were. So that's been the reaction, and particularly one of the most memorable aspects of the tour has been for the cast as well. In almost every show during our talkback, we've had survivors. People who were there in Delhi, who have personal stories to tell. Who, of course, had a lot of difficulty sitting through the performance.
So do they come and talk to you
They do.
Their experiences right after?
They do. And I'll share one anecdote with you. We were in Ottawa. So there was a Sikh gentleman in the audience who was probably around my age. So he was a young man at the time of 1984. And he very eloquently talked about his experiences. Well, it also turned out that his 21-year-old son was in the audience. And later on, they told us that father and son in 21 years had never had a conversation around 1984. And
it's a sensitive topic.
It is,
really
in many ways, many ways.
Kind of, so do you go back and revisit the script every time you hear some incident, a real incident, or a different perspective, or a certain aspect that you may not have heard before, and somebody?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, just now in the car coming over here, we were actually discussing changes to make and things to add, and definitely before every stop on tour, we have pickup rehearsals, and now that I'm back, I work things, and we re-energize things and change things last minute. And I think that's really sort of the nature of a touring production as well. When you do the show so many times, there's always things that you're still discovering. So those changes are definitely happening, and yeah. So
even more matured script each time you go into it, is that how?
I think a more mature performance, probably. Yeah.
Okay. All right, great. So we do have another performance coming up on January 30th, which is in Boston University, and we do request all our viewers to go and watch that. It's going to be a wonderful performance. I'm going to be here, so I'm going to definitely go watch it this time. Looking forward to it. I actually heard good reviews about it, not just from the reports, but also from some of my friends who have attended it in various cities that you've been to. So looking forward to it myself.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for being here today.
Pleasure.